Okay, now I'm going to look at some of the specific issues that are raised in the context of project management within a youth work context. This is drawn from a document that's on Moodle, but which was put together by the European Commission, the Council of Europe, as a project to advise youth work organisations about the challenges that there is in terms of framing project management in a youth work context. So I suppose one of the first, so you can look at this presentation and read the guidelines in parallel. The presentation is drawn from the guidelines. Okay, so I suppose the question being asked here is, what are the factors that have encouraged this shift towards project management? And the real challenge, a lot of youth workers find this challenging because a lot of the sort of language around project management, the mechanisms, the tools around project management have come from business. And in many ways, this is reflected in the tools that we're going to use in terms of logical framework and different tools like that, even though they have been used in development over a good number of years. So if you look at the emergence of youth work programs in the European Union, the reason that we need project management is because a lot of these have become quite substantial. There's a lot of funding, there's a lot of multi-annual programs, there's a lot of government support for projects in the youth work sector. So the other thing as well is that the need has become quite substantial in the context of the economic decline and the economic cycles that there's been over the last 20 years, is that projects have been reduced, and therefore there's been a demand for margins to be tightened, for efficiencies to be demonstrated, and then when more money is invested, there's a demand for projects to be upscaled and maybe mainstreamed. So I suppose the structure and the evidence that project management requires or imposes is something that the funders in particular, whether they're European or national, are beginning to demand. The other, I suppose, issue that we need to be conscious of is that the whole liberal or the neoliberal ideology has emerged, and business practices have migrated into the social sector. Like it or loathe it, it's a fact of life. It's a fact of life that I suppose managerialism and neoliberal ideologies have become part of the language and the structure of youth and community work. And part of this at a European level is because of the challenges in reconciling the different ideologies and the different approaches to civil society that there has been in Eastern Europe in particular. So I suppose the legacy of centralized communist control has meant that in a lot of countries, the capacity to manage and deliver projects at local community level has been quite limited, because there hasn't been either the experience of civil society managing projects, or there hasn't been the experience of I suppose individual project management in the private sector that Western European countries have experienced. So those skills, those processes, those experiences hadn't been there in Eastern Europe, and there was a strong feeling that they were needed in order to deliver projects at community level. So the other sort of issue really, or the other reason that project management has come to the fore, is that there has been a shift in emphasis within politics of development and politics of youth work and the politics of what is funding being directed towards, and while in the past that might have been quite nebulous, it might have been quite general, it might have been quite integrated, it might be quite trusting of the practitioners to identify their own priorities. Now it's very clear that projects are pushing towards, and funding is pushing towards particular outcomes, be that in mental health, be that in employment, be that in youth training programs. So there is this sense in which the emphasis has moved very much politically from a general commitment to youth work as an approach to youth work as a mechanism of delivering services. And that plays into, I suppose, the emphasis, the project management or the management emphasis. The other, I suppose, sort of philosophical issue that has created this emphasis as well is, I suppose, a postmodern focus on individualism. In many ways what that means is, while it might not be down to the individual young person, but certainly in terms of small initiatives that are isolated from other organizations or even other initiatives within organizations, has become the norm. So youth groups are operating almost independently as opposed to part of an integrated service. Now that isn't necessarily always the case, but certainly the structure of funding and projects is moving it in that direction, and it's doing so from an ideological perspective, whereby I suppose one of the driving theories in modern society, in contemporary society, is postmodernism and individualism. Okay, so on a practical level, what are the sort of values that we're being asked to adhere to within youth and community work? And it's values like efficiency and accountability, equality and independence, economy and consistency, and quality in terms of the delivery of services. So these are all issues that youth work and youth work organizations are faced with. And these are, I suppose, the type of values that, some of which, are intrinsic to youth work, but some of which are very much being encouraged by the mechanisms and the programs that are out there. Transparency and visibility is another issue. Realism in terms of what can be achieved, flexibility, creativity and innovation, and then participation, modernity and employability. And all of these are values that some of which sit very comfortably with youth work, others maybe not so much. So if you look at projects at a European level then, and this is important because a lot of what we're looking at is going to be in a European context, that the values around projects at a European level, be they Erasmus or Interreg or Horizon 2020 or whatever projects they might be, one of the objectives or one of the values associated with European funding is around mobility and solidarity. So the fact that you are bringing young people together, the fact that you are encouraging them to understand each other's lives, others' cultures, others' countries, that in itself is a satisfactory outcome or a value from a European perspective. Solidarity then is that they work in common cause to address common concerns. And that again is something that youth work projects often deal with. The other value associated with youth work projects is around self-reliance and creativity for young people. Again, something which is very close to the core values of youth work. Within a European context, the whole issue of xenophobia, racism and anti-Semitism is increasingly, and has always been, but is increasingly important, as is the context of cultural diversity within a European context, but also in terms of us understanding more about external cultures, and certainly the cultures that migrants from outside the European Union are bringing to our communities. So all of these issues are really important priorities and values at a European level. And what we need to be conscious of is these are maybe a lot less tangible than the ones that went before. They're not as easily measured and possibly not as easy accounted for. So there is a sense in which we need to be very conscious of the complexity associated with values within the youth work context. this idea of developing European identity is important, participation of disadvantaged young people, and the active participation by young people in our institutions and in society in general, again, are important values in any youth work project. Gender participation, intercultural learning, and informal education, all of which are the essence of good youth work. Okay, so I'm sort of just going to look at maybe just very briefly some of the theoretical context informing education in youth work. And I have to sort of excuse the language in this, it's somewhat obtuse, but I hopefully will be able to explain it to you better than it's written. But that a lot of youth work is informed, as is community education and development education, by the work of John Dewey. Now, a lot of what he would have been talking about was how it was about critical education, critical pedagogy. He would have been one of the founders of, I suppose, the concept that became known as critical pedagogy. And he would have felt that education in this context is a communal reflective process. So it's about education being a process undertaken with other people, not in isolation. That an important part of education in youth work is about young people becoming conscious and observers of their environment. And when we say environment, we mean their social, economic and political conditions in which they live. That what we also want them to be conscious of is we want them to understand the historical context in which those conditions have evolved and how those conditions, those types of similar conditions have played out in the past or in other social or global contexts. So we want them to be aware of the history of the political, social and economic context in which they live. We also want them to be able to understand and to analyze the conditions of their lives, and particularly if they live lives of or under oppression. So it's important for them to, first of all, it's a communal process. They need to observe the conditions of their life. They need to understand the history of those conditions. They need to be able to analyze. Okay, so if we move on in terms of a project, we need to ingrain some of this critical social education into projects. So we need to make sure that a project is about progression from ideas to action, that it does sit itself within a social, economic and political context, that it's not apolitical, that it's not denying a political context in which young people live their lives, that it also understands that a project is located in a social, geographic and time-based context. So a project that works in Tipperary in 2018 might not work in Tipperary in 2025, or might not work in Greece in 2018, or might not work in North Tipperary in 2000. So the location of the project, both in social, spatial and in time, is important. The other thing is that education should, good community education should allow people to experiment. It should create a space, a safe space for people to experiment, and to do so collectively. Okay, so all of these things are characteristics of good community youth development education. So if we look then at, I suppose, some of the characteristics of projects in youth work, so that there must be a purpose, there must be a clear objective, there must be a problem that this project is going to solve, that it must do so in a realistic way, and that there must be time and space limitations. It cannot go on forever, nor can it cover an unrealistic geographic space. Projects, it has to be accepted, are oftentimes very complex. The values that we've identified just now in terms of European projects, but also in terms of youth work approaches, would indicate that complexity is an intrinsic part of projects. The other characteristics of projects are that projects are collective, they're not an individual, they're unique, that they are an adventure, they should be an exciting new way of doing things. They must be assessed, and they must be made up, or they should be made up in coherent, intrinsic, identifiable stages. Okay, so this is the final, there's one more slide after this, and then we're finished. And this is just to indicate to you, just to demonstrate that in projects there's different ways of visualizing projects. So on the left hand side we have a sort of a very linear hierarchical structure, defining, planning, implementing, monitoring, evaluating, and capitalizing. So that means completing or monetizing or reconciling the finances of a project, or so that's a very linear one. Then the one on the right is a more organic one. So it's looking at, say, a spiral. So the emergence of the project comes from the organization, the environment in which it works, the consultation with so there's an organic process of evolution of a project, and it emerges then and it grows not in a linear way but in a cyclical way, always and continually being informed by monitoring and evaluation. So the objectives evolve over a period of time. So that's a much sort of more creative way of looking at projects. And I suppose then this is we look briefly at the circle, the project cycle. Now this is sort of like a project spiral, and again it's not an unusual graphic to use in terms of youth and community work, whereby the project begins, it evolves and grows based on emerging ideas, analysing, evaluating, planning, implementing, so that you're not locked within the limits of the original project, but that the project can grow and evolve. Okay, that is the I suppose an overview of some of the challenges that there is within project management in a youth work context, but maybe it gives you some concepts that you can read into further.